found life on other planet, it would be, totally different. I think the evidence is compelling that if we did find life on other planets based on the same principles of physics and chemistry, there would be eyes, there would be wings, there would be a lot of these same structures and intelligence as well. Intelligence is very, very helpful for survival. In my mind, at least, this makes it a lot easier to think of, okay, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is a universal purpose to why we are alive.
Okay, I'm joined here with Dr. Samuel Wilkinson. Samuel is the author of a new book called Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. So, Dr. Wilkinson, welcome to the show. It's an absolute delight to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to speaking today with you.
Okay, so let's jump in here. If people leave our conversation today with just one thing, one impactful thing, what would you like that to be?
I would hope that they could have a space for a framework where they see that science does not necessarily mean that there isn't an overall purpose to our existence.
Interesting. Okay. Now, there seems to be an underlying assumption that informs most of our culture that most of life is, you could almost say, a random accident, that everything just happens by chance, nothing means anything. To you, what do you see? You work as a psychiatrist as well. So, what do you see are the costs of holding this worldview?
Well, I think this worldview really started to take root around the time that Darwin first really described in detail the theory of evolution. And since that time, there has been this assumption that you can't have any purpose or intention or intent or anything like that in biology. Those words have, at least from the standard bearers, have been like heresy in biology. And I think the consequences of that are profound but somewhat subtle over the last, it's been over 150 years now since Darwin first published his most influential book, The Origin of Species. And what I see, certainly not all of this is because of the way we've conceptualized biology, but I think some of it is where a lot of people don't have the same maybe purpose or meaning that they would otherwise have. There's a lot of other things that have led to that. Technology has made it difficult to decline, and in participation in religion and community groups and so forth have also contributed to this. But kind of they've all in some ways gone together, and it's not a good thing for humans, for their mental health, when they kind of are adrift and without a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
What do you feel is the most compelling evidence you've discovered that suggests that life actually might be purposeful? And maybe we could talk here about the work of Simon Conway Morris as well to bring that in.
Yeah, so I wrote this book based on a time in my life when I really was troubled by what I thought science implied about life, and that really that life was just an accident, and so ergo there is no universal purpose to our existence. And a lot of this had to do with this this notion of randomness. Okay. I think most people, when they think of evolution, they think it's unfolded in a totally random and haphazard way. There was a prominent biologist at Harvard. His name was Stephen Jay Gould, and he kind of had this. He said, well, if you could somehow rewind the tape of life and let it unfold again, things would have unfolded in a totally different way. Everything was so contingent upon chance circumstances, and there would certainly be no human life. And if there were life, it would be totally different. And it turns out there's a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that it was much more of a non-random process than we initially understood it to be. And this has to do with the phenomenon where similar structures will develop over and over and over and over again.
And so we find the same structures evolving independently, like for example, wings in birds, bats, butterflies. Can you tell us about why is this so significant, do you think?
Well, I think it makes room for there to say, for a long time the thought was evolution is not going in any particular direction. It's just it's random. No one knows where it's going. Evolution does not know where it's going. And in theory, many of these things could be predicted. So, like you mentioned, birds, bats, and butterflies, they all have wings, but they all develop them independently. The most recent common ancestor, we're told, of birds, bats, and butterflies did not have wings, and so they all independently develop these things. Eyes is probably one of the best examples. Eyes have developed independently about 40 different times, is what biologists tell us. And our eye is essentially the identical structure as the eye of an octopus. Yet the most recent common ancestor, which was maybe 550 million years ago, was the best estimate of us and octopuses, did not have an eye, and so we each kind of, in a way that's kind of almost eerie, we've developed the same structure independently. So you get the sense that there's a direction here, and this I'm trying to be intellectually honest here, and this doesn't necessarily prove that there is a purpose, but I think for a long time we thought the majority of evolution was random, and I think there's still some room for randomness, but in my mind and my reading of the literature, it's flipped. Whereas I would say most of evolution is not random. It's a combination of randomness as well as, but a lot more non-randomness. So, maybe like the color of your eyes may be due to the random reassortment of your parents' genes, but the fact that you have eyes and they're structured the way they are seems to be kind of inherent in the self-organizing principles of matter. So there are these maybe higher order principles and laws that we don't understand a lot about this, but they seem to guide or constrain evolution to go in certain ways and not others. So for me, this helps get rid of a stumbling block to thinking that, oh, life was just a total accident, and if we found life on other planet, it would be totally different. I think the evidence is compelling that if we did find life on other planets based on the same principles of physics and chemistry, there would be eyes, there would be wings, there would be a lot of these same structures, and intelligence as well. Intelligence is very, very helpful for survival. In my mind, at least, this makes it a lot easier to think of, okay, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is a universal purpose to why we are alive.
For sure. Now, we have common metaphors for life in our culture. You often hear, life is a journey. I remember Alan Watts would say life is a musical thing and we're sort of supposed to sing or to dance while the music is playing. And the metaphor that you use to describe life is a test. Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you arrive at this understanding of our situation?
Well, this brings me to another thing that when I first delved into this topic was very, I didn't like it. And that is what I thought evolution implied about human nature. Okay, so, and I think most people, if they don't have a deep understanding of, some of the science behind this, they intuitively think that evolution implies that we're selfish. So there's this phrase that was coined a couple years after Darwin's first book, The Origin of Species, survival of the fittest. You've probably heard of that, and most people have probably heard of that. And there are some problems with that phrase. Biologists tend not to use it much anymore, but I think it's helpful because most people intuitively kind of grasp the concept. And when you think about, survival of the fittest in relation to what types of social characteristics would emerge, off the bat, you start thinking of, selfishness, aggression, greed, dishonesty, that sort of thing. And this for me was like, is that really the picture of human nature that is accurate? And if it is, that's a bitter pill to swallow, right? But it turns out it's a lot more complex. And certainly there are lots of cases where humans do behave in ways that are selfish, but there are lots of examples where they behave in the opposite way. And one of the best ways to explain this is by turning that phrase into a question. So you say survival of the fittest what? And this gets at what biologists refer to as the level of selection. Okay, so are we talking about a survival of the fittest individual or a survival maybe of the fittest family or group? And those different levels have critical implications for the social characteristics that would unfold. So let me, if it's all right, share a brief story to kind of drive home this point. All right. So in the year 1864, this is a story I get from a colleague of mine here at Yale, Nicholas Christakis. In 1864, there were two shipwrecks at the same time and place. The two ships crashed on opposite ends of what are called the Auckland Islands. These are about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. And the first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. And fortunately, after about a year and a half, with incredible resourcefulness and ingenuity, all of the crew from Musgrave's ship survived. Now, the other ship was led by a man named George Delgarno. And unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died. Now, what was the key difference? Well, the first ship, the crew formed a remarkably cohesive and cooperative group, and they helped one another. This was really epitomized really in just the first minutes or so of the shipwreck, when the captain himself, Musgrave, he carried a wounded man on his back as he swam through the torrential waves to the safety of the shore. Okay. Now, Delgarno's group, on the other hand, unfortunately, they kind of took an every man for himself approach. And this was also shown within the first few days of the shipwreck, when they left a wounded man behind to die on the shore as they searched further inland for food and other resources. So you see, on the one hand, in this context, it was not selfishness, but it was cooperation and altruism and this group cohesion that led to an enhanced chance for survival. And so you can imagine lots of scenarios in our distant past that were maybe like the shipwreck, where survival was a group goal and a group endeavor. And those groups and those families that worked together were better off than those that were full of bickering and selfish individuals, right? There are two biologists. You mentioned you had David Sloan Wilson on the show. David Sloan Wilson and E.O. Wilson, I think, sum this up perfectly, this principle, when they say, selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and everything else is commentary. And so that, for me at least, that really helps me understand how, when you look at these different levels of the survival of the fittest, they're going to produce or put forth opposing, really, social characteristics. Okay, does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I think that quote is maybe human nature ever. There's another person that I think whose work we both admire is the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
And he says that human beings are 90% chimpanzee, 10% bee. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this ratio. Do you think that, and he's referring to 90% chimpanzees and 90% selfish, 10% the bee would be a lot more altruistic. So do you think he's got that ratio right, or is there more of a balance here?
I think there's more of a balance. If it's all right, let me come back to that in just a sec. But to finish off, because I do want to answer your original question, which was, why do I think life is a test? And so going back to these two levels and how they produce different characteristics, you may ask yourself, well, which level in our history was most important. And I think that they both were at different times. They both kind of led to different traits. And so this is produced within us, these competing dispositions. This is one of the reasons that life is such a struggle, because in a very real way, we are pulled in different directions. We all have the capacity for selfishness, but also the capacity for altruism. We have the capacity for aggression, but also cooperation. And there's so many other social traits that you could find these kind of opposing patterns with. And when you combine that with the sense, and I don't know exactly where this comes from, it's still a mystery to me, but the data to me is compelling that we have it, the ability to choose, right? Free will. When you combine that with these, what I call the dual potential of human nature, it seems like life is a test, and we're meant to choose between, in maybe terms that aren't used so much today, we're meant to choose between the good and the evil within us. Life is a test of character. There was this, when I used to watch cartoons when I was a kid, and once in a while you'd see in the cartoons a man walking and he had an angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other, right? And I think that may be more true to what life is actually like than we realize. So that is why I have this metaphor for life as a test. Does that?
Before that's really well said. Before we move on, what effect has having or holding this perspective had on your quality of life? Because some people might hear this and think that's quite heavy. That's quite a serious view in life. So how has this affected your quality of life?
Well, I mean, you can't take it too seriously. Another way to frame this that maybe isn't quite so heavy is that one of the purposes of life is to overcome your weaknesses and to accentuate your strengths. So we all are a mix of strengths and weaknesses, and one of the things that we can do, I think, to best make progress and maybe pass this test, if you want to phrase it like that, is to work on overcoming our strengths, but to be patient with ourselves and to do our best to develop the talents and the strengths which we've been given to not only help ourselves but help other people, especially. So I recognize that can feel a bit heavy. I do think there's going to be, I hope I hope the grading of the test is going to be merciful and not maybe so harsh. But it is a metaphor for me that is compelling.
What weakness are you most proud of overcoming in the course of your lifetime, would you say?
I don't know that I've overcome any of them. I mean, I think part of me, part of my experience is, so I have 5 children. I'm a wife and 5 children, and I think for me, they have helped me the most to overcome some of my weaknesses. And I still got a long way to go, but having children is kind of like a crash course in how not to be selfish, because you just can't, you can't think every time you start to think about yourself, like, okay, I got to help my kid. And so that for me has been, and I think Mother Nature has, there's almost a design to this, that that when we are embedded within family context, this helps us to overcome our weaknesses. We're like maybe a rough stone, and we need to get some of the edges chipped away. And one of the best ways to do that is within our interactions with our family and our close friends, our personal relationships. So you asked what's one of the weaknesses that I'm most proud of overcoming. I think I'm much less self-centered than I would be if I didn't have my family.
Hmm. So when I was preparing for this, one of the sentences I discovered that really jumped out at me, and it's about Jonathan Haidt's work, but it was, so he uses the brain, or the metaphor of the brain being like a rider on an elephant.
Yeah.
And what you said was something along the lines of, the trick is to steer the elephant into the environments or the situations where it's going to be on its best behavior. So could you maybe tell us about what Haidt is getting at with this metaphor, and then maybe elaborate a bit about on that sentence too?
Sure. I take this metaphor from height, as you note, and I don't know that he takes it necessarily in this direction, but I think it is helpful to take in this direction where, as he has noted, the rider can kind of steer the elephant which way to go as long as the elephant doesn't have a strong desire of his own, right? But if your elephant wants to go left and you're trying to pull it right, you're no match for it, right? And that's why he used an elephant, because it's so big and so strong. Um,
And
now,
when he's talking about the elephant, we're talking here about the limbic system, these powerful emotional parts of the brain, the writers, the rational neocortex, the planning, the logic, and that's the
correct.
conflict.
Yeah, that sometimes these things are in conflict. So, I think it is important to try to lead our elephants to places where they're going to be on their best behavior. And the counterpart to that is to avoid the elephant from wandering into places where it's going to be on its worst behavior, right? And we all again have different strengths and weaknesses. Let's say you're riding an alcoholic elephant that wanders into a bar. It's going to be really, really hard to control that elephant once it's inside the bar, right? And so it's better not to let the elephant wander into the bar in the first place. So for me, and I think there's a lot of compelling evidence that this is a fairly general principle, if you're leading your elephant into a room where one of your primary responsibilities is caring for your children, then you're forced to think outside of yourself. And certainly, look, there's no guarantees, and there's certainly scenarios where we read about them in the newspaper, like how could we let this person become a parent? But most of the time, most parents, I think, are really pulled in a positive direction, even though it's really hard. So if you can, and I think this is especially important for men who have a more tenuous link to their children than women do. But if men can lead their elephant to a room where one of their responsibilities is helping to care and raise and rear for their children, that tends to really help them develop emotionally and in terms of maturity and so forth, and it draws them into the community in ways that they might otherwise not be drawn.
Has writing this book changed your thinking or approach to psychiatry in any way?
Well, it's helped me realize just how important relationships are. And we probably don't pay enough attention to this as a field of psychiatry. Most often you think of psychiatry, what do we do? We prescribe meds. On occasion, we'll have more powerful treatments. I do a lot of work with ketamine and esketamine, some TMS, and so forth. But one of the things that we need to do in psychiatry is we need to interface more and collaborate more with sociologists. When you think about the advancements in infectious disease, taking another field of medicine, so certainly infectious disease doctors and the development of vaccines have made it's been a huge milestone in public health. But really, the profession that has really helped reduce the spread of infectious disease have been engineers and city planners and those who plan for the sewage and the plumbing and so forth. These people provide an infrastructure that makes it so that we can have more hygienic conditions. And I think in psychiatry, we need to interact more with sociologists who can maybe help us understand what is the social infrastructure that we need to establish for people to thrive and maximize their mental health and so on and so forth. I think a lot of the data is there, but we need to bring it into psychiatry, and psychiatrists need to recognize more just how critical the social setting in which patients live. The thing is that's hard. You can't make a prescription and say, I prescribe you one great spouse, or I prescribe you one great best friend. So it's harder fix, but I think it definitely has more effect than most of the treatments that we do have at our disposal now.
No, that's a very good point. It reminds me of the work of a philosopher called Ken Wilber, and he talks about there's the four quadrants of human life. So there's the individual interior. This is your mind, your thoughts, your feelings, and all the rest. There's the individual exterior. So this is your behavior, your habits, all these different things. There's the collective interior. So this is culture, like all of the different, yeah, culture. And then the last part is the collective exterior. So this is societal systems, institutions, and all the rest. And he says that if you're gonna, if you're thinking about trying to improve your life or anybody else's life, you should think about these four different elements and try and address each one of them rather than just picking one quadrant. And that's what we tend to do in these different fields. Like some will overly focus on the societal elements, some will overly focus on the medical elements and all the rest. So you've got to take the full picture into account.
Yeah, yeah. I yeah, no, I agree with that.
So why is John Bowlby one of your intellectual heroes?
So John Bowlby, using a framework of evolution, really developed a critical insight into human nature and relationships with what he termed attachment theory. So John Bowlby was born in the early 1900s. As you mentioned, he's a British psychiatrist, and he came of age professionally when a lot of people in so-called mental health experts did not think that relationships were very important. They thought relationships were means to an end. And Bowlby basically saw this and said, that doesn't really make sense. That doesn't jive with my experience. That doesn't jive even with my observations of, he worked a lot with people who studied animal behavior. And so Bowlby, using a framework of evolution, he recognized the critical nature of the tie between the infant and the parent. And most of the time it's a mother for biological reasons that has the closest emotional tie. He observed that human infants, as opposed to the offspring of other animals, they're extremely premature when they are born. Okay, so scholars scholars who study infant development will sometimes refer to the first few months of life as the quote fourth trimester. Okay, in kind of implying that we are essentially born half baked. When you think of other animals, say giraffes, foal, that sort of thing, they can walk within a few days of being born. Of course, for us, not only is it more than a few days, it's sometimes a few years. And so they're utterly dependent on the care of their parents. And this, even though newborn infants don't look like they're interacting a whole lot with the world, there is an infrastructure, a neural infrastructure that is being laid, that is being impressed upon, and it's just this remarkable process that we still kind of don't really have gone much more deeper than the tip of the iceberg. But there's this incredibly important relationship that forms between that, the infant and their primary caregiver, that really provides the basis for all future relationships. And that is essentially attachment theory.
Can you maybe tell me about the research of Renee Spitz that happened in the 1940s? And I just thought this was super interesting and something a lot of people might not have heard about.
Yeah, so Spitz, Bowlby, I think, drew upon the work of Spitz, and Spitz was an Austrian psychiatrist who did work with orphanages, and in the kind of the early 1900s, say 1920s or so, orphanages had really high mortality rates, and the thinking was that in order to reduce them, we need to improve hygienic conditions, and they would essentially sterilize everything. Okay, and they would go overboard, and so these infants would have essentially very little to no interaction with other human beings for the beginning months and sometimes years of their lives. And Spitz made this seminal observation. He conducted a study where he compared the outcomes, the developmental outcomes of orphans, infants in an orphanage, and then he also compared them with infants that were born to quote unquote delinquent mothers. So these are mothers who were incarcerated at the time they give birth. And the framework with the correction system was that they're not going to separate the baby from the mother, at least for the first year. And so the baby will be in the prison with the mother. And so he compared those two groups, and they had, in some ways, similar conditions. In some cases, the orphans may have had better access to, to some things than the infants of the prison mothers. But of course, the key difference was that the infants in the prison group had access to their mothers, who essentially spent all their time, doting upon their infants. And at the end of the year, it was night and day difference. Many of the infants in the orphanage had just totally languished, while the infants that were born to incarcerated mothers were thriving in many ways. And so he concluded, I mean, this was just evidence that supported Bowlby's later theory of attachment, to show how critical those relationships were for not only psychological outcomes, but physical outcomes. I mean, there were I want to say 35% or so of the infants in the orphan study died within a year or so. So, relationships are a pretty powerful thing. The U.S. Surgeon General, noting the mental health crisis we're going through now, has rightly called attention in our country, and it's not just our country, it's a lot of countries, but what he calls the epidemic of loneliness. Okay. And so it's not just in infancy when relationships are important, but all throughout our lives, relationships, positive relationships, have not only important implications for mental health, but also for physical health. An often cited statistic is that loneliness is about as deadly as obesity or cigarette smoking for your physical health, for your risk of dying, which is a pretty incredible statistic.
That's shocking. So every year, so the Weekend University, the organization that we run, we organize a summit. And last year it was on addiction. The year before that, I was in psychotherapy. This year it's on attachment. We're interviewing probably going to be 30 of the world's leading psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists in this area on attachment. And for me, we're doing this because we've kind of arrived at the understanding that maybe the most important variable in mental health is attachment, right? And this is a weekly reminder to me that relationships are the most important thing, right? And I need that reminder, because we have these cognitive illusions that it's going to be other things that are going to lead to that. Can you tell us about this? And also, have you found any ways that you've been able to keep this top of mind and make it like a top priority? Because everything in our society is telling us otherwise. I don't know why, but it seems to be going that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I come from a religious background, and this is one of the reasons that I go to church on a regular basis, because when I'm at church, so often I'm reminded, hey, it's your relationship. It's your relationship, dummy. Don't get led astray to the wealth of the world or whatever it is, or status that you may be seeking. I'm a Christian, and in Christianity, you have the two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor. And so, I mean, love is essentially the foundation of relationship. So when you think about it, there's a strong emphasis, or at least there should be, sometimes there's not, but there should be the strong emphasis on your relationship with the divine, if you have that belief, and your relationship with those around you, those close to you. So for me, that is a very important practice, is regular religious participation that helps remind me that my brain is not necessarily wired to predict what is going to make me happy, and is sometimes going to take me in the wrong direction, and I need to kind of bring it back to the other side and make sure I'm spending that time with my family. As part of my particular faith, there's been a strong emphasis on, hey, at least one night a week is family night, and you gotta be together put the soccer, put your work commits, whatever, put them aside. You got to at least once a week focus on a family activity. And that's been, I think, a really beneficial thing. Especially, my 5 kids, all of whom are still living at home. Just a really important thing to help us bond and focus on those relationships.
I think there's so much wisdom in what you've said there. It reminds me of, so we did this, as I mentioned, we did do these summits. Last year we did a summit on addiction. And one of the things that kept one of the things that kept coming to mind for me during that was that, we've all kind of got this hierarchy of values. And what happens in addiction is that is hijacked by the
Yeah,
substance or the behavior of choice. But
it
what
is.
you're talking about here, these two things, these two fundamental things, your relationship to the divine and your relationship to the other people in your life, these are the things to have at the top, and then everything else nests underneath, and that is potentially a good sort of compass for your life.
Yeah, no, it's been a huge. Uh, I've been quite fortunate. It's been a huge blessing in my life to kind of have that kind of North Star to orient me from time to time. And you have to continue to reorient yourself, because as you mentioned, there are these sort of cognitive illusions that will lead us in another direction. And not that you shouldn't be striving or working hard or doing your best at work, but there needs to be a balance, right?
Sure. I think I might get a tattoo that just says it's the relationship dummy on my hand, and then I see it every day. Um, so you mentioned free will earlier. I think
Yeah.
this is super important to everything we're talking about here. Like, what are your thoughts on free will? Because, you have Robert Sapolsky coming out with this book here now where he's basically saying that it doesn't exist. Like, what's your input here?
So listen, Robert Sapolsky is a brilliant guy. He's one of the kindest guys I know as well. I just think he's wrong. I think there's compelling evidence that um, that we do have the ability to choose between competing uh, outcomes and alternatives. So um, if you want to get into the nitty gritty, I'm happy to do so. Free will, when you dive into this topic, at some point you need to kind of set definitions, because a lot of people end up arguing about things that they're not. It's semantics, right? So, but I definitely disagree with Sapolsky on more than just semantics. So he seems to have this definition of free will that to me just doesn't make sense. That if it did exist, it would kind of invalidate other fundamental notions like the self or the individual. So what he'll say is like, show me a neuron that is firing, that is not caused, that is not influenced in one way or another, that is totally independent of past experience or biology or what have you. And when you think about, okay, if you had someone who was making decisions that was totally independent of their prior experience or their biology, that wouldn't really be free will. That would be randomness. And that would really invalidate the notion of a self that is a consistent pattern of kind of behavior and actions over time. So I do think it's important to point out that I think his definition of free will is I just think it's too high. And if that thing did exist, it wouldn't really be free will. Okay. So I have no problem conceding that our choices are influenced by our behaviors, by our past behaviors, by our past experiences, by our biology, but it's pretty clear that they're not deterministic, not 100%. And we probably overestimate how much free will we actually have, but I think it's clear that we do have some, and that when you look in the psychological literature, that what we think influences our behavior. So a lot of free will deniers will say that your thoughts are not actually causing your behavior at all. They are just what you might think of as byproducts, right? That the neurons are somehow, in ways that we don't fully understand, the neurons are causing your thoughts to happen. And so your thoughts can't in turn cause your neurons to go one way or another. And it's pretty clear that at least to my reading of the literature, has been falsified. and that we do have what you would call top-down causation of behavior. Now, I'm getting a little technical here, so if we need to kind of back up and I can try to explain that a little bit better, I'm happy to do that.
No, you've explained that very well. And maybe this is, I don't know if it's linked or not, but in your conversation with Michael Shermer, which was a really interesting discussion. I recommend people go check that out after this as well. You guys talked about death. You talked about one of the things that was mentioned was, and I might be getting this wrong, but it was you you think there's a possibility that our consciousness extends beyond this lifetime and that we are here by choice, by consent. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on this. Do you think what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is one of the great mysteries from philosophy, from neuroscience, from psychology. This thing we call consciousness. Where does that come from? How does that get produced by the brain? How does it interface with the brain? Going back a little bit to my conception of life as a test, if you believe that, and I really do, I don't think it makes much sense that there's a test and there's nothing after, there's no grade given or anything like that. So I'm very comfortable recognizing or believing that, in some form, we continue to exist after this life. And I think most people have an intuitive sense, maybe hope, if not belief, that is the case. So I can get into try to get into the particulars of theology. They're gonna differ somewhat from the religions of many other people, but I think that there's a place for us to be reunited with loved ones, with friends and family, and that if we kind of do our best, some of those relationships are going to be eternal in significance and in time.
Well, I definitely like the perspective anyway, and I certainly hope you're right. Um, so another question I was curious to ask you, you went through this existential crisis that seemed to be the seed for this book about 15 years ago or so.
Yeah.
If you could get a letter to that young man, with a kind of few key points on it, for what would you tell him in that letter?
Well, I would basically give him the book, and that's essentially, I would say, look, it's much more of a non-random process than you realize that are coming into existence. And I would say, look, human nature is a paradox, and there's what I call this dual potential of human nature where you're pulled in different directions. And when you combine that with free will, that affirms your belief that you've had that life is a test, and you're going to be happiest and you're going to do your best on the test when you focus on your personal relationships, and in specific, when you focus on your family relationships. Those are the key points that I would have written to myself from 15 years ago.
That's beautiful. The quote I really like that you said as well. If the purpose of life is to strive to overcome the weaknesses within us, the meaning of life is to cultivate strong relationships. Do you want to expand on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, so the philosophers might take me to task and say I'm throwing these words purpose and meaning around like haphazardly. They're not exactly the same, they're linked. When you ask people what is the most meaningful part of their lives, so the Pew Foundation in the United States, they do these very large surveys, sometimes based in the US, sometimes worldwide, and they will ask people open-ended questions. What is it that gives you meaning and really motivates you? And they'll ask open-ended questions, and they'll get the responses. They have to tally them up and categorize and code them and sort them. And the most common response is their relationships with their family, and rearing children is also very high on that. That's by far the most common. The second most common is work. Okay, but work is around maybe like half as important. Okay, so I think that's important to recognize because, at least in a lot of Western cultures, there's such a focus on work. And again, there is a place for that, but sometimes I saw in medical school that people would focus on work to the exclusion of, okay, do I want to have a family? Do I, like, what are my future relationships? What do they look like? They'll spend all this time, many hours a day, studying medicine or whatever it is, and leave so little time for thinking and planning how are their relationships going to unfold. And so I think that's another way that we need to come back and look at the data and recognize that my brain is not always going to lead me, or even this culture is not always going to lead me in the direction that is going to lead to lasting satisfaction and happiness.
For sure. In your conversation with Greg McKeown, you were talking about this, a really good question to ask yourself is if you've got a couple of hours free at the end of the day, if you
Yeah,
hypothetically had that, how would you spend it or how would you think you'd spend it? And when I thought about it, I was like, I'd probably, work was probably high in the priority there.
yeah,
And it's a good thought experiment to run.
it is. It is. And for most of us, myself included, I get a little disturbed. I was like, is that really, most people when they retire, they don't look back and say, man, I wish I spent more time in the office. They say, I wish I would have spent more time with my relationships. And so it's important to to continually remind yourself of
100%. So you're doing a tour for this book now and you're doing a lot of interviews. And I imagine whenever this happens, you're probably getting asked a lot of the same questions. Are there any aspects of the book that you feel are particularly important that aren't getting attention that you'd like to maybe raise more awareness of?
That's a really good question. I One thing I like to point out, and I want to be careful when I go down this road, but for people, a lot of the people that I've interacted with or I went to medical school with, there is across the West, there is a falling fertility rate. There's the number of children that are being born is dropping. And there's a lot of reasons for that, probably. I don't know all of them, but I think there is this sense that having children is really hard. And that is definitely true. I don't want to pretend and say, oh yeah, it's a breeze. But the way that evolution has shaped us, and I can explain this further, that the strongest forms of love and trust and altruism and affection occur within the relationship between parents and their children. And that has to do with the extreme immaturity with which our offspring are born, human offspring are born. So that, and it is inextricably linked with the challenge of parenting. So in 2014, there was this great book by a woman named Jennifer Senior. The title was, let me make sure I get this right, is All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenting. Okay. Now, the only beef I have with that title is the word modern, because yes, it is hard today, but it's always been hard. Ever since kind of we evolved to have these infants that needed our attention for like 15 years before they could be somewhat independent. Parenting has always been hard, but that is inextricably linked with the joy of it. Does that mean, and it's this really interesting principle, I think almost on a cosmic spiritual level, that you can't have that deep love without compelling sacrifice. You ask 10 parents, what's the most difficult thing you've ever done? 9 out of 10 times they'll say, raise my kids. You ask them, what's the most rewarding thing you've ever done? 9 out of 10 times they'll say, raise my kids, right? And it's just that, at the confluence of biology and psychology, you can't separate this joy from this sacrifice. And so I guess I just want to encourage, some people, there's a variety of reasons people may not have children. But for those who may be like kind of on the fence, or like, I don't want to do it because it's so much work, I would say do it. Jump in, and because you can't know now the level of joy and happiness that you will feel at the birth of your first child. It's something that surprised me. You know, I'm not like I'm before my kids were born, and even this way now, I'm not someone who like loves little babies or anything like that. But when my own kids were born and I saw, you know, they were flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, it was like, holy cow. It's like my heart grew another chamber that I didn't know existed. And so again, I want to be careful. I don't want to be presumptuous, but if you're on the fence, if you've got a stable married relationship and you're on the fence, oh, kids are so much work. They are, but you might miss up an opportunity to experience the profoundest sense of joy that nature has created.
Fantastic. Well, Samuel, that's a great note to end on. I want to say thank you so much for your time today. I know you're just off a flight and you're probably exhausted doing this, so I really appreciate it. I definitely recommend people to pick up the book. Where would you send them to get it? Would, any particular places, publisher? What would you recommend?
There's a website for the book. It's samueltwilkinson.com. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. Simon Schuster is the distributor. So there's lots of different places you can check it out. But thank you for the endorsement, and I hope it can be helpful to those who may be struggling with the reconciliation of science with the sense of purpose that we have of life.
It's been a pleasure, Samuel. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our mastered library of over 5 years of psychology conferences, including over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, unlimited CPD certification, transcripts, quizzes, premium passes for our annual conference, online courses with Richard Schwartz and Deb Dana, and more. The cost is £97 for 1 year, which breaks down at around 27p per day. The best bit is you can try it out for 30 days completely risk-free, as all orders come with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're interested, please go to twmembers.com for more information.